My name is Claire, and what I'm about to tell you still makes my stomach twist every time I think about it. After 3 long weeks abroad, flying back across the ocean with nothing but excitement in my chest, I pulled into my parents' driveway and noticed something horribly wrong. The garage door was open, sunlight spilling across the concrete floor, and the spot where my 1969 Corvette Stingray should have been sat empty. That gleaming red dream, the car I had worked 70-hour weeks for 5 relentless years to buy, the car that tied me back to my late grandfather, it was gone. I dropped my suitcase right there on the lawn and stormed inside. "Where's my car?" My voice cracked from both exhaustion and rising panic. My mother glanced at me as if I'd asked about the weather, then sneered with a half smile that cut sharper than any blade. "Thanks to your car, your sister is having the time of her life right now," she said. My father looked up from his recliner, guilty eyes darting toward hers, but said nothing. For a moment, the room felt like it tilted sideways. The air sucked out of my lungs. "You did what I whispered, barely able to breathe." My mother crossed her arms, her chin lifting the way she always did when she knew she was about to defend the indefensible. "You're successful. You'll buy another car someday. But your sister, she needed this chance." I let out a bitter laugh, a sound that even startled me. Needed what chance? Needed me stripped of the one thing I'd poured my soul into so she could sip cocktails on some luxury cruise. I know what you might be thinking, that surely this is a misunderstanding, that maybe they just loaned it out or moved it for storage. No, they sold it. Sold it behind my back while I was thousands of miles away, trusting them to guard what was most precious to me. And when I demanded answers, they didn't apologize. They justified. That's when something in me snapped. My whole body was shaking, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug crescents into my palms. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears louder than my own voice as I shouted, "That car was mine, registered in my name, paid for with every ounce of sweat I had to give. You had no right." But my mother only scoffed, calling me dramatic, calling me materialistic, as though grief over betrayal this deep could ever be reduced to vanity. Let me pause here, because before I tell you what happened next, I want you to think about something. Have you ever had a moment when someone you trusted most, your own family, crossed a line so far that you could never go back? A moment that forced you to decide who you are, what you're willing to accept, and whether blood ties are enough to excuse betrayal. If you've ever felt that sting, that gut-wrenching realization, then you already understand why this story nearly broke me, and why it changed me forever. And that's the hook, right? That's the truth that dragged me into the nightmare of losing everything I thought was safe. Because the theft of my Corvette wasn't just the loss of a car, it was the opening shot in a war over boundaries, loyalty, and the meaning of family itself. When people ask me where my obsession with cars began, I always smile and think back to those sacred Saturday mornings of my childhood. While other kids lounged in front of the TV watching cartoons with bowls of cereal, I was tugging on my boots and running outside to wait for the low rumble of my grandfather's pickup. He would pull up right at 8 a.m., the truck coughing and growling as if it were alive, and I'd leap in beside him. He always called me Ace, his little partner in the garage. We'd spend hours bent over engines, my tiny hands holding flashlights or passing wrenches, my eyes wide with wonder. He never treated me like a kid who couldn't understand. He explained every piece of machinery, every hiss of steam, every click of a socket wrench. "Cars aren't just machines, Ace," he'd tell me, grease smudging his cheek. "They've got personalities. They've got souls. You just have to listen." And I did. I listened so hard that I began to believe each vehicle had a heartbeat. That belief shaped me in ways I couldn't explain. I can still remember the first time he pulled the cover off his prized possession, a 1969 Corvette Stingray Rally, read the curves, catching the light like liquid fire. My breath caught in my throat. I walked around it reverently, fingers hovering just above the gleaming surface. One day I whispered to myself, "I'll have one just like this." That wasn't just childhood fantasy. That was a promise, a vow carved into my bones. From that moment on, everything I did bent toward that vision. My parents never understood it. My mother sighed over grease stains on my jeans. My father shook his head when I rattled on about carburetors at the dinner table. To them, it was strange, unfeminine, impractical. To me, it was destiny. And maybe that's why losing the car cut so deep. It wasn't simply about the $85,000 I'd poured into it. It was about a dream carried from age 7, a promise I'd kept to a man who believed in me when no one else did. Without that foundation, maybe I wouldn't have had the strength to survive the betrayals that were coming. Before I tell you more, let me ask you something. If you've ever had someone dismiss your passion because it didn't fit their picture of who you should be, tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from right now, and what dream have you chased? Even when people rolled their eyes, I want to know, because stories like this aren't just mine. They belong to anyone who ever fought to protect a piece of their soul. And while you're down there, if you believe in standing firm for what you love, hit that subscribe button. That way, you won't miss what comes next, because trust me, you'll want to see how this story plays out. Back in that garage with my grandfather, I didn't know any of this was coming. All I knew was that I had found my anchor in a world that often felt unsteady. He'd pat the hood of that Corvette and wink. She's a beauty, Ace. Someday you'll understand what it means to keep a promise like this. I didn't realize until years later that I'd been keeping that promise not just to myself, but to him, to the man who looked at a little girl with dirt under her fingernails and saw potential, not disappointment. And so, when my parents told me decades later that they had taken my dream and traded it away for my sister's vacation, it wasn't just theft. It was desecration. It was erasing the bond between a grandfather and his granddaughter, between a promise and the one person who believed I could keep it. That's why this story matters. That's why I can't let it go. Growing up in my parents' house was like living in two different worlds under the same roof. My younger sister Lily was the princess. She got the new clothes, the glittering ballet recitals, the birthday parties that filled our backyard with 50 guests and balloons that floated over the fence into the neighbor's yard. And me, I was the afterthought. The one who got hand-me-downs that didn't fit the quiet cake at the kitchen table instead of a sweet 16 bash, the polite pat on the back when I asked for something that didn't align with their idea of who I should be. It wasn't Lily's fault. I never hated her. She didn't ask for the spotlight. It was just handed to her. But it was impossible not to feel the sting every time I was reminded of the imbalance. When she asked for dance lessons at 6, my parents immediately found the most expensive studio in town. When I asked for auto shop classes at 12, my mother waved me off. We can't afford extras this year. The sting wasn't just about money. It was about being told in 100 small ways that what I loved didn't matter, and by extension that maybe I didn't matter either. The message was clear: Lily was delicate, special, in need of protection. I was strong, self-sufficient, expected to manage on my own. That double standard followed us everywhere. She was cushioned from consequences, I was buried in them. She got a brand new car for graduation. I got a lecture about student loans. I'll never forget the look on my father's face the day I came home with oil under my fingernails from tinkering with a friend's beat-up sedan. He shook his head, half disgusted, half confused, as though I were some puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture they had framed for our family. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" My mother sighed, and I swallowed the ache that question always triggered. Those wounds stayed with me. And they were why, years later, when my parents betrayed me in a way I could never have imagined, it cut so much deeper than just the loss of a car. It was the ultimate confirmation of what they'd always believed, that my sacrifices were negotiable while Lily's desires were sacred. Sometimes people say, families aren't perfect, everyone plays favorites. But it's different when favoritism isn't subtle, it's institutional. It shapes the air you breathe. It makes you second-guess your worth every time you walk through the door. And the cruelest part, they didn't even notice. To them, it was just natural. To me, it was erasure. Looking back, maybe that's why I worked so hard, why I was willing to endure sleepless nights and back-to-back shifts. Because deep down, I needed something that was mine alone, untouchable. Something no one could hand to Lily instead. My Corvette became that symbol not just of independence, but of proof. Proof that I could rise above the limits they set for me. Proof that my passions weren't silly distractions, but the very fuel of my strength. But in those years before I earned it, I often sat in the shadows of Lily's spotlight, feeling invisible. I don't tell you this to make you pity me, I tell you this so you'll understand the foundation of what came later. Because betrayal doesn't hurt in a vacuum. Betrayal cuts deepest when it confirms every fear you've carried since childhood. And maybe some of you know that feeling too. Maybe you've been the responsible one, the strong one, the sibling who had to clean up the messes or sacrifice while another was shielded from reality. If you have, then you know exactly why my parents' decision to sell my car didn't just feel like theft. It felt like they had finally said out loud what their actions had whispered for years, that Lily's happiness mattered more than my dignity. That realization that my family's love was conditional transactional was far heavier than the loss of steel and chrome. It was the moment I understood that if I didn't set boundaries, if I didn't reclaim my worth, I'd spend my whole life as the background character in someone else's story. And I wasn't about to let that happen. By the time I left for college, I had already made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. I would never again depend on my parents for anything. If they couldn't value me the way I deserved, then I'd build a life on my own terms, even if it meant exhaustion, loneliness, and sacrifice that would break most people. I still remember those years vividly. I carried a full course load, determined to graduate with honors in finance, but I couldn't afford to be just a student. So I became three other people too: the barista who opened the coffee shop at 5 a.m., the library assistant who reshelved books until closing, and the waitress who hustled through weekend shifts to pay for rent and tuition. Sleep became a luxury I rarely indulged in. My body ran on caffeine and sheer stubbornness. But grades mattered. Every night after my shifts, when most students were out partying, I was at my desk forcing my eyes to stay open while I pored over spreadsheets and case studies. I earned a 4.0 GPA, not because I was brilliant, but because I refused to let fatigue define me. The thought of that red Corvette, my promise to my grandfather, was always at the back of my mind. It wasn't just a car. It was proof that my sacrifices had a purpose. After graduation, I landed a coveted position at a prestigious investment bank in Chicago. The hours were brutal, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, but I didn't complain. I packed lunches instead of eating out. I shared a cramped apartment with two roommates. I walked past boutiques without a second glance, ignoring the designer heels and handbags my colleagues flaunted. Every dollar I saved went into a single account labeled Corvette. My friends thought I was crazy. They spent bonuses on trips to Europe, on high-rise condos with skyline views. I declined their invitations with a smile. They didn't understand. I wasn't depriving myself, I was building something that mattered more. 5 years. 5 years of saying no to nearly every temptation, of pouring my youth into late nights and early mornings, of missing weddings and birthdays because I couldn't afford to lose focus. And then one morning, scrolling through an online auction, I saw it, a 1969 Corvette Stingray Rally Red, just like the one my grandfather had shown me decades earlier. My heart stopped. The seller was a collector in Wisconsin, downsizing his garage. The price, $85,000. Exactly what I had scraped together. Driving to meet him felt like walking into a dream. I inspected every curve, every detail, the purr of the engine vibrating through my bones. I signed the papers with shaking hands and slid into the driver's seat, the leather warm beneath me. As I steered onto the open road, tears blurred my vision. I whispered into the wind, "We did it, Grandpa." For the first time in my adult life, I felt whole. That car wasn't just metal and rubber. It was my independence forged into steel, my resilience embodied in chrome. It was the bridge between who I had been, the overlooked, underestimated girl, and who I had become, a woman who kept her promises no matter how impossible they seemed. Every Saturday, I'd take it out for a careful drive, the sun glinting off its polished surface heads, turning as I passed. I babied that car, covering it religiously, storing it properly through Chicago's brutal winters. It wasn't about showing off. It was about honoring the years of sacrifice that had led me there. And yet, even as I cradled that dream with everything I had, I never imagined the greatest threat to it wouldn't be rust, or thieves, or accidents. The real danger was much closer to home. The real danger carried my last name. Because betrayal, I would soon learn, doesn't always come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it comes from the very people you trusted most, the ones you thought would guard your dreams with the same reverence you did. When I first met David, it wasn't in some candlelit restaurant or through a carefully arranged setup. It was at a dusty car meet on the outskirts of Chicago, the kind of place where gearheads clustered around open hoods like surgeons in an operating room. I had parked my Corvette a safe distance from the chaos, unwilling to risk a scratch. That's when I noticed him leaning over a Mustang grease smudged on his cheek, laughing with a couple of other guys. He looked up, caught sight of my Stingray, and his grin shifted into something closer to awe. "Is that yours?" he asked, jogging over like a kid on Christmas morning. I nodded, bracing for the usual disbelief. Most men assumed I was borrowing a boyfriend's car or posing for attention. But David didn't question it. He peppered me with questions only a real enthusiast would ask: engine details, restoration history, even the torque ratio. For the first time, I wasn't defending my ownership. I was sharing it with someone who got it. That night, we drove side by side down Lakeshore Drive, engines humming in harmony. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself. He didn't treat me like the overlooked daughter or the responsible sibling. He treated me like someone extraordinary. Our relationship grew fast, fueled by shared dreams and long nights tinkering in garages. But it wasn't just cars. David understood sacrifice. He worked construction, sometimes 12-hour days, saving every penny to one day open his own shop. He knew what it meant to go without, to push past exhaustion for something bigger. We built our bond on that mutual fire. Of course, my parents weren't impressed. They had always imagined me with someone polished, someone who wore suits and carried a last name worth bragging about at country club dinners. David was the opposite. Calloused hands, secondhand jeans, and a stubborn pride that matched my own. "He's not good enough for you," my mother sniffed once, as though I'd brought home a stray dog. But to me, David was proof that love could be built on equality, not hierarchy. He didn't want me to be less so he could be more. He wanted us to rise together. That was new. That was everything. We married quietly in a courthouse. No lavish reception, no choreographed dances. Just us, 2 rings, and a promise that whatever storms came, we'd weather them as a team. David moved into my small apartment, and slowly his laughter filled the rooms that had once only echoed with exhaustion. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the world alone. It was during those early years of marriage that my Corvette became more than my dream. It became our dream. We spent weekends upgrading it, polishing it, arguing good-naturedly over which modifications to attempt. The car symbolized my past, but with David beside me, it also represented our future, a testament to what we could build together with grit and determination. Yet the shadow of my parents lingered. Every family gathering was a reminder of how little they valued what I had built. They fawned over Lily's husband, a corporate lawyer who wore designer suits and drove a Tesla. They made sly comments about David's calloused hands and how we must be struggling without help. And every time I swallowed the urge to snap back, reminding myself that proving them wrong didn't require their acknowledgement. Still, it gnawed at me. Deep down, I wanted them to see the truth that happiness wasn't about polished appearances, but about loyalty, sacrifice, and shared purpose. David gave me that. My Corvette gave me that. But my parents were blind to it. And blindness, I would soon discover, has consequences, because when the chance came to strip me of the very symbol of my independence, they didn't hesitate. But here's the thing. Betrayal always leaves a scar, but scars can also remind you of your strength. And even now, as I remember those days, what stands out most isn't the sting of my parents' rejection. It's the steady way David squeezed my hand in defiance, his voice low but resolute. They don't define us. We define us. And maybe that's why I want to pause here and ask you, have you ever been in a relationship that made you stronger, that felt like armor against the world's cruelty? If you have, you know the power of finding your person. And if you're here with me listening to this story, maybe hit subscribe, because this community is about resilience, about standing tall even when those closest to you try to cut you down. Together, we're not alone. Married life with David was not easy, but it was real. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above a noisy diner, the kind of place where the smell of frying bacon seeped through the floorboards every morning. Most people would have complained, but to us it felt like freedom. We weren't chained to my parents' expectations, and every choice we made was ours alone. Still, freedom came with its own price tag. Bills piled up. My banking job demanded more hours than I thought possible, and David's construction work wore his body down to the bone. Yet every evening, no matter how exhausted we were, we sat down together at our rickety kitchen table and mapped out our future. We dreamed about buying a small house with a garage big enough for his shop and a driveway wide enough to showcase the Corvette. It was during one of those late-night talks that David first brought up kids. Someday, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, I want a little girl who looks at you the way you look at that car, like it's her whole world. His words hit me deeper than I expected. For the first time, I imagined a life that wasn't just about survival or defiance. I imagined a life filled with love we created ourselves. But my parents never stopped trying to undermine us. They'd drop hints during family dinners. You know, Lily and Mark are already looking at homes in the suburbs. Don't you want that stability? Or they'd point out David's rough hands with a tone that dripped with pity. Every comment was designed to remind me I had chosen a path they didn't approve of. And though I tried to ignore it, the weight of their disapproval pressed down harder every year. Then came the night of Lily's promotion party. She had just made partner at her law firm, and my parents rented out a rooftop lounge to celebrate. David and I went mostly out of obligation, dressed in our best, though we knew it would never measure up. The night was a blur of champagne glasses and shallow congratulations until I heard my father's voice cut through the crowd. "Can you believe it?" he laughed to a group of guests. "Our younger daughter driving around in that old hunk of metal while Lily and Mark are investing in real assets. A Corvette. As if that's going to build her a future." The words slammed into me like a punch. My Corvette wasn't just a car. It was every sleepless night, every double shift, every moment of sacrifice made tangible. And hearing him reduce it to a hunk of metal in front of strangers made my blood boil. I caught David's eye across the room and his jaw was clenched tight. He didn't have to say anything. I knew he was holding back for me. That night, as we drove home in silence, I realized something crucial to my parents. I would always be the reckless daughter who chose the wrong man and the wrong life. Nothing I achieved would ever be enough because it wasn't their version of success. The realization stung, but it also freed me. From that moment forward, I decided that my life wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about building something right for myself and for David. And I want to pause here to ask you, because maybe you've been there too. Have you ever had someone dismiss your greatest achievement, treating years of sacrifice like nothing? If you have, drop a comment below. Share your story. I read everyone, and trust me, your words remind others they're not alone in this fight. Because here's the truth, families can wound us in ways strangers never could. But sometimes those wounds are exactly what force us to build a stronger armor, to stand taller than we ever thought possible. And while I didn't know it then, my parents' scorn that night was just a preview. The real betrayal, the one that would cut deepest, was still waiting. I thought the rooftop party would be the low point, but life has a cruel way of proving you wrong. A few months later, my parents invited us to their house for Sunday dinner. It felt like a trap the moment we walked in, their smiles too polished, the dining room table set, like a negotiation rather than a family meal. We hadn't even made it to dessert before my father cleared his throat. "We've been talking," he began, his tone calm but heavy, "and we think it's time you let go of that Corvette." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "Excuse me." "It's impractical," my mother chimed in, dabbing her lips with a napkin, as if this were some casual observation. "You're married now. You need stability, not a toy draining your finances." David's hand tightened around mine under the table, silently telling me to keep calm. But my chest was already burning. That car isn't a toy. It's mine. I worked for years to buy it. Father leaned back, eyes narrowing. "But it's not just about you anymore, is it? A family makes sacrifices. Lily and Mark are buying property. Meanwhile, you're still pouring money into an old car that'll never return value. We could help you trade it in for something practical, maybe even put that money toward a house." It was framed like kindness, but the venom dripped beneath the words. They weren't offering help. They were demanding control. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist against the table and remind them that every dime I spent on that Corvette was mine. But David's steady grip kept me grounded. "We appreciate the concern," he said evenly, "but that decision is hers, not yours." The room fell silent. My mother's lips tightened, my father's jaw locked. Lily smirked from her seat, swirling her wine glass like she was watching a performance. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush. Later that night, as David and I drove home in the very car they wanted me to sell, I felt the weight of their disdain pressing down harder than ever. The Corvette's engine roared beneath us, but for the first time, the sound felt fragile, like they could snatch it away if I let my guard slip. "Don't let them take it from you," David said, staring straight ahead. His voice carried the kind of steel you only hear from a man who's fought his own battles. "That car is more than metal. It's your story, and no one gets to rewrite it." I nodded, blinking back tears. He was right. But their pressure wasn't going to stop, it was only going to escalate. And here's the strange thing about betrayal, it rarely happens in a single blow. It builds slowly, brick by brick, disguised as concern, disguised as love, until one day the mask slips and the truth cuts clean. Looking back, that dinner was the first crack in the mask. They weren't just trying to undermine me anymore. They were preparing to erase me. Which brings me to you. Because I know some of you have faced this too, people who pretend their interference is for your own good, when really it's about control. If you've lived through that, don't stay silent. Tell me in the comments. Sharing your voice isn't just therapy, it's rebellion. What I didn't realize then was that their plan was already in motion. The car I had bled for, the car that carried my pride, my independence, my freedom, it was already marked. And soon, I would learn just how far my own parents were willing to go. The ambush at dinner haunted me for days. I replayed every word in my head, hearing my father's voice telling me my Corvette was nothing but a liability. It wasn't just a car they wanted to take, it was the last piece of my independence, the proof that I had carved a life outside their shadow. But then came the night everything changed. It was late, close to midnight, when David shook me awake. His face was pale, his voice sharp. "Get up, something's wrong." We rushed outside and the smell hit me before my eyes adjusted to the dark. Smoke, thick, acrid, and suffocating. My heart stopped when I saw the orange glow flickering near the garage. I sprinted barefoot across the cold pavement, screaming before I even saw it. The Corvette was on fire. Flames clawed at the paint, devouring the body I had spent years saving for. The tires hissed, popping like gunfire, and the windshield collapsed inward with a sickening crack. My knees buckled, and if David hadn't grabbed me, I would have thrown myself into the blaze to stop it. The fire department arrived within minutes, but minutes felt like centuries. I stood in the driveway, helpless as they drowned the car in a torrent of water steam, rising into the night sky like a ghost. When the last flame was extinguished, all that remained was a blackened shell. My Corvette, my dream, was gone. The chief patted David on the shoulder. "We'll investigate, but looks like arson." The word stuck in my throat. Arson. Someone had done this deliberately. I didn't want to believe it. My mind scrambled for explanations, an accident, a freak electrical fault, but deep down, I already knew. I saw the smirk on Lily's face at that dinner. I heard the edge in my father's voice when he talked about letting go. My own family had crossed a line I never imagined possible. For days, I barely spoke. I went through the motions at work, came home, and sat in silence, staring at the empty spot in the garage. David tried everything to comfort me, but even his touch couldn't break through the fog. It wasn't just grief, it was betrayal on a level I couldn't process. One night, David sat beside me, his voice low and firm. "They think they've broken you, but this is where you rise. You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for. And you still have me. You still have us." He was right. That fire wasn't the end of my story, it was the spark of something else. And maybe that's where this story turns toward you. Because I know some of you watching have had something ripped away by family, by betrayal, by forces you thought you could trust. And when it happens, you have two choices: let it crush you, or let it forge you into steel. If you've ever had to rise from ashes like I did, share your moment below. Your story could be the fire someone else needs to keep going. The Corvette was gone, yes, but I wasn't. And what my family didn't realize was that by destroying what I loved, they had unleashed something they could never control: my resolve. And soon, I would begin to fight back. The night of the fire split my life clean in two, before and after. Before, I was still clinging to the idea that maybe somehow my parents and I could mend things. After, that illusion was gone. Watching my Corvette reduced to ashes wasn't just heartbreak. It was a message. And I knew exactly who sent it. For a while, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Families fight. Families say cruel things. But families don't torch your car in the middle of the night, do they? Every time I replayed the dinner conversation in my head, the smirk on Lily's lips, my mother's icy dismissal, my father's condescending tone, I felt the truth pressing harder against my chest. Still, I needed proof, and proof came in the form of a slip-up. A week after the fire, I got a voicemail from a mutual friend of Lily's. She didn't mean for me to hear it, she thought she'd dialed Lily directly. Her voice was giggly, careless. "Girl, that party was wild. Who knew your sis's car would actually go up like that? Guess she'll finally stop showing it off now, huh? I froze. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. When I confronted my parents with the recording, their reactions told me everything. My mother turned pale, my father clenched his jaw, and Lily stormed out before I even finished playing it. Not one of them denied it. Not one. That's when something inside me shifted. For years, I'd been the good daughter, bending, compromising, swallowing my pride in the name of peace. But that night, staring at their guilty faces, I realized peace had never been the goal. Control was. And if they wanted war, they had it. I started documenting everything, their calls, their texts, the threats disguised as concern. David helped me set up cameras around the house, upgraded security, and urged me to talk to the police. And for once I did. Filing that report felt like ripping off shackles I hadn't realized I was still wearing. But even as I built my case, a darker question gnawed at me. Was justice even possible when the enemy was your own blood? Could the law really protect me from people who shared my last name? That's where I want to pause for you watching this. Have you ever been trapped in that space where your gut screams the truth but your heart doesn't want to believe it? Where every instinct says walk away, but loyalty holds you hostage? This is the point where you don't just watch, you lean in, because the choice I made next changed everything. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them erase me. If they thought burning my car would silence me, they underestimated just how much fire was left in me. And so while the ashes of my Corvette cooled in the driveway, I began planning something they would never see coming. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. This was about reclaiming the power they had stolen from me my entire life. It was about proving to them, to myself, that no matter how deep betrayal cuts, it can never define me unless I let it. But here's the thing, when you decide to fight back, you have to accept the cost. And soon, I would find out just how high that cost could be. I had always thought of myself as someone who avoided conflict, someone who believed that patience and silence could eventually heal wounds. But the voicemail changed everything. It was no longer about saving face or avoiding drama. This was about survival. My parents and sister had crossed a line so deep it could never be undone. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer. I remember walking into his office, clutching a manila folder stuffed with copies of texts, the voicemail transcript, and pictures of the charred remains of my Corvette. My hands shook as I placed everything on his desk. "I need to know what I can do," I said, my voice trembling but firm. He studied the evidence carefully, then looked up with a mixture of sympathy and cold practicality. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a family dispute. This is criminal." But he leaned forward. "You have to be ready for the fallout. Once this goes to court, there's no going back." No going back. The phrase echoed in my mind as I left his office. David squeezed my hand as we walked to the car. "You're not alone," he reminded me. "We'll face this together." His unwavering presence was my anchor, but even with him by my side, I felt the weight of the coming storm pressing on my chest. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings with investigators, endless paperwork, and tense phone calls. My parents reached out not to apologize, but to threaten softly at first, then openly. "If you keep pushing this," my father growled over the phone, "don't think the rest of the family will ever forgive you." Forgiveness. What a twisted word when wielded as a weapon. I documented everything, even those threats. The more they tried to intimidate me, the more determined I became. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was protecting the life David and I were building, a life that had no place for manipulation or control. But the hardest part wasn't the paperwork or the threats. It was the silence that followed once word spread. Cousins stopped calling. Old family friends stopped answering messages. It was as if my entire world had decided I was the villain in someone else's narrative. Late at night, I would sit at the kitchen table staring at the empty spot in the garage, wondering if I'd made a mistake. Was I really strong enough to go through with this? Was it worth tearing my family apart in the pursuit of justice? David would find me there every time and remind me of the truth they already tore it apart. "You're just refusing to let them bury you in the rubble." That thought kept me going. And to those of you watching, I need to ask, have you ever been made to feel like the villain simply for telling the truth? For standing up when everyone else wanted you to stay quiet? Drop your story in the comments, because silence only protects the guilty, and your voice might be what keeps someone else from breaking. By the time the court date was set, I had become someone else, sharper, harder, unafraid to face the fire. The Corvette may have been reduced to ashes, but I wasn't. I was walking proof that sometimes you have to let everything burn so you can finally see who stands with you when the smoke clears. And soon in that courtroom, the world would finally hear the truth. The courthouse loomed above me like a fortress gray stone and glass gleaming in the morning sun. I had walked into plenty of intimidating buildings before interviews, offices, even hospitals, but this was different. This was the battlefield. And the people waiting on the other side weren't strangers. They were my own blood. David squeezed my hand as we passed through the security check. Remember, he whispered, you're not here to prove you're strong. You already are. You're here to prove the truth. Inside, the air was heavy with whispers. Reporters lingered near the steps, sniffing out drama in what they thought was a family feud. To me, it was a funeral, the burial of the family I had once believed in. When I saw them, my stomach clenched. My father sat stiff in his suit jaw, clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. My mother's face was a mask carefully painted with indifference, but her eyes flickered with something sharp, fear, maybe, or rage. And Lily? She smirked, just as she had at that dinner, her gaze cutting straight into me like a blade. The trial began with the evidence. Photos of my charred Corvette were projected onto a screen, each one a dagger to my chest. The voicemail played the giggly friend's words, echoing through the room like poison. My lawyer spoke clearly, laying out the timeline, the threats, the pattern of manipulation. Then it was their turn. My father's lawyer painted me as an ungrateful daughter, desperate for attention, willing to destroy her family's name for sympathy. My mother wept on cue, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe her own child would do such a thing. And Lily leaned into the performance, pretending to be shocked, offended, devastated. For a moment, I felt the room tilt against me. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The spectators whispered. Maybe they were buying it. Maybe blood ties still held more weight than truth. But then it was my turn to speak. I rose, knees trembling, but voice steady. I told them everything, the years of being silenced, the dinner where my father humiliated me, the smirk that haunted me the night of the fire. I spoke about betrayal, about losing not just a car, but a symbol of my independence. And I didn't cry not once because I wanted them to see the steel in my spine. Family isn't about blood, I said, looking directly at the jury. It's about respect. It's about safety. It's about love. And when those things are gone, what's left isn't family, it's control. And I won't be controlled anymore. The room fell silent. For the first time since the fire, I felt the balance shift. And maybe that's the moment I want you to sit with watching this. Have you ever had to stand in front of people who doubted you, people who thought you were the villain, and speak your truth anyway? That's the moment your voice matters most. And if this story resonates with you, don't just watch, subscribe, join this community, because you deserve a place where your truth is safe. The trial was far from over. There would be cross-examinations, more lies, more attempts to twist reality. But as I stepped down from the witness stand, David's eyes met mine, shining with pride. For the first time, I felt it too. I wasn't just fighting for justice, I was reclaiming myself. And in the days ahead, that truth would ignite consequences none of us could escape. The second day of the trial started quietly enough. The courtroom buzzed with the same murmurs, the same flashes of cameras as reporters jostled for position. But I could sense it, something was about to shift. The prosecution began with a new piece of evidence. Your Honor, my lawyer said, standing tall, we've obtained additional phone records. These include text messages exchanged between Lily and her friends the night of the fire. The judge raised an eyebrow. Proceed. The room went silent as screenshots appeared on the screen. There it was in black and white, Lily bragging, half-drunk, texting, Dad says it's about time she learns. That car was just a start. My chest tightened. A start. Gasps rippled across the room. The jury's eyes snapped to Lily, who had gone pale, her smirk evaporating. My father leaned forward, whispering something harsh into her ear, but the damage was done. Then came the witnesses. A neighbor testified they'd seen Lily near my driveway the night of the fire, her hoodie pulled up, pacing with someone who looked a lot like my father. Another spoke of the bitter arguments, the screaming matches that had become impossible to ignore. Piece by piece, the mask cracked. My parents shifted uncomfortably, their once confident posture now brittle. But what truly shattered the illusion was when my lawyer replayed the voicemail again this time, juxtaposed with Lily's own text messages. The jury didn't just hear the cruelty, they saw it spelled out, time-stamped, undeniable. I sat there staring at them, at the family I had once begged for approval from, and I realized something chilling: they weren't ashamed of what they'd done. They were only ashamed they'd been caught. My lawyer leaned toward me during a recess. "We're winning this," he whispered. "But it's not just about the car anymore. This is about intent, about malice. This could go further than you imagined." Further, the word echoed. During the recess, I stepped outside the courthouse for air. A few supporters had gathered strangers holding signs that read, "Justice is family too, and silence protects no one." A woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "My parents disowned me for speaking out," she said softly. "Watching you gives me courage." Her words hit harder than any courtroom argument, because this wasn't just my story anymore, it was bigger. And maybe that's something you watching need to hear right now. Standing up for yourself doesn't just change your life, it sends ripples that touch others who thought they were alone. If you're here with me, don't just watch in silence, leave your voice in the comments. Because your story might be the light someone else is waiting for. Back inside, the defense scrambled. My father's lawyer objected, tried to dismiss the texts as immature chatter. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, claiming she never knew any of this was happening. Lily, though she broke. She snapped at the lawyer, snapped at my parents, finally shouting, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." The room froze. The judge's gavel struck, calling for order, but it was too late. The truth had slipped through. The jury had heard it. I leaned back in my seat, my pulse pounding. For the first time, it wasn't just me against them. It was the truth against their lies. And as the gavel echoed through the chamber, I knew the verdict would change everything. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Lily's outburst still lingered in the air, bouncing off the oak-paneled walls like a curse that couldn't be unsaid. It wasn't supposed to go this far, the sentence replayed in everyone's minds, and for the first time, the jury didn't look at me with pity. They looked at her with suspicion, with judgment. The judge ordered a short recess after the chaos, but I didn't move from my seat. My legs felt rooted to the ground, heavy with years of silence that had just begun to lift. David leaned close and whispered, "That crack just split the whole facade. You're not alone in this anymore." When court resumed, the prosecution pounced. They asked Lily direct, cutting questions. Who was she texting? Why was she near the driveway? Who told her it was just a start? Her answers were shaky, riddled with half-truths. Each attempt to twist out of responsibility only tied her tighter in the web she and my parents had spun. Then came the bombshell. My lawyer introduced a witness none of us had expected: Lily's so-called best friend, the one from the voicemail. She walked in nervously, clutching her phone like it was a shield. Under oath, she admitted that the message wasn't a joke. "They laughed about it," she said, voice trembling. "They said it was time to humble her, that the car wasn't even the end of it." The courtroom gasped. My mother dropped her tissue, face pale as porcelain. My father clenched his fists, staring daggers at the witness, but it was useless. The truth was out. I sat straighter, a quiet fire building in my chest. For years I had been told to stay quiet, to endure, to forgive. But now the whole world could see the cruelty I'd lived with. And more than that, it was no longer my word against theirs. Yet even in that moment of vindication, my emotions weren't simple. I looked at Lily, her face blotchy from suppressed tears, her bravado crumbling. She was my sister, the girl I had once shared secrets with under blankets, the one who had begged me to cover for her when she snuck out as a teenager. How had we ended up here in opposite corners of a courtroom? The judge recessed again, and I stepped outside into the cool air. A reporter shouted a question, asking if I hated my family now. I didn't answer because the truth was too complicated for a soundbite. Hate wasn't the right word. Betrayal was. Loss was. And beneath it all, a strange, hollow grief. David placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not just winning a case," he said softly. "You're breaking a chain. And sometimes breaking chains makes noise. Sometimes it shatters everything around you." I nodded, but my chest felt tight. I wanted freedom, justice, but I hadn't expected it to feel so much like mourning. And that's something I want you to think about too, as you listen to my story. Breaking away from toxic family ties isn't clean, isn't easy. It's messy, it's painful, and it often feels like you're losing more than you gain, until one day you look back and realize you've gained everything. If this truth hits home, stay with me, because the next part of this story will show you how far the fallout really goes. Back inside, Lily refused to look at me. My parents whispered frantically with their lawyer, their polished confidence gone. The cracks were widening and everyone could see it. But I knew this wasn't over. Families like mine don't collapse quietly. They thrash, they fight, they drag everyone down with them. And I braced myself because I could feel it, the worst storm hadn't even arrived yet. The third morning of the trial began with an eerie stillness. Reporters still swarmed outside, cameras flashing, but the energy had shifted. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a spectacle, a reckoning. And I was at the center of it. As I stepped into the courtroom, I caught sight of my parents. My mother's carefully styled hair looked wilted, her eyes puffy. My father sat rigid, jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Lily, though, looked broken. Her once smug expression was gone, replaced with a hollow, vacant stare. The prosecution wasted no time. They pulled up financial records that showed my father had recently increased the insurance on my car just months before it was destroyed. The jury leaned forward, whispering among themselves. I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't just about spite anymore. It was premeditation, calculated, cold. The defense scrambled. They tried to paint me as the dramatic daughter seeking attention, twisting events to punish her family. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too solid, too damning. Then the prosecution called their final witness, an insurance investigator. Calm, steady matter of fact, he explained how the fire was intentionally set and how my father's policy increase fit perfectly into a pattern of fraud. He ended with words that made the entire room shift. This wasn't negligence. It was deliberate. The silence afterward was suffocating. My parents avoided my gaze. Lily buried her face in her hands. And me, I sat frozen, every piece of me torn between fury and grief. I remembered birthdays without presents because they said money was tight. I remembered working part-time jobs as a teenager to buy my own clothes while my sister was given everything. And now I realized they hadn't just dismissed me, they had profited from my pain. During a break, David leaned over. We've got them. Tomorrow is closing arguments. Then, it's verdict time. Verdict. The word sat heavy in my stomach. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was raw. Because victory in this case meant my family, the people I had once prayed would love me, were about to be legally branded as the ones who tried to destroy me. Outside the courthouse, more supporters gathered. Some held signs with my name. Others simply chanted for justice. One young man approached me, his voice breaking. I haven't spoken to my parents in years. Watching you fight this makes me feel less alone. His words steadied me. Maybe this wasn't just my trial. Maybe it was a mirror for anyone who had been betrayed by the very people meant to protect them. And if you're listening right now, maybe you need to hear this too. Sometimes the blood we think binds us is nothing compared to the courage that frees us. Stay with me because the next chapter will show what happens when truth finally collides with judgment. When the recess ended, my parents didn't return right away. The judge grew impatient. Their lawyer finally admitted they had been in the hallway discussing strategy. But I knew what that meant: panic, desperation. As the session closed for the day, I walked past them. My father muttered under his breath, "Ungrateful." My mother's eyes were glassy, but she said nothing. Lily didn't even look up. For the first time, I felt no urge to reply. Their words didn't hold power anymore. I stepped out into the fading sunlight, the courthouse looming behind me, and thought tomorrow the world will know. The final day arrived like a thunderstorm. The courthouse was overflowing, reporters pressed against the doors, strangers with signs lined the sidewalks, and the air carried the weight of something irreversible. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The judge called for order, and the attorneys delivered their closing arguments. The defense clung desperately to the narrative that I was exaggerating, painting myself as a victim to punish my family. But their words fell flat. The jury had seen too much. When the prosecution spoke, every syllable cut like glass. They laid out the trail of evidence, the insurance hike, the orchestrated accident, the voicemail, and Lily's slip in court. They tied it together with a chilling conclusion. This was not neglect. This was a deliberate betrayal by those who should have loved her most. The jury left to deliberate. Minutes stretched into hours, each tick of the clock echoing in my chest. My palms were clammy, my heart thundering as though it wanted to escape. Finally, the jury filed back in. Their faces were unreadable, the foreperson rose paper in hand. On the count of insurance fraud, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit destruction of property, guilty. On the count of attempted harm, guilty. The words crashed over me like a tidal wave. My breath caught, tears stung my eyes. The room erupted, some gasped, others whispered. My parents slumped back, their empire of denial crumbling. Lily sobbed into her hands, her shoulders shaking. I sat still, trembling. Justice had been spoken aloud, but it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like finality, the severing of ties that could never be mended. The judge addressed the courtroom, sentencing postponed, but consequences inevitable. As marshals guided my parents out, my father's eyes burned into me. For a fleeting second, I searched his face for regret, but found only bitterness. Outside, reporters surged forward, questions flying. One asked, "Do you feel victorious?" I paused, steadying my breath. "I don't feel victorious," I said slowly. "I feel free." The crowd went silent. Cameras clicked. And in that silence, I realized that freedom sometimes looks like loss, like walking away from people who share your blood, but not your love. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights glowing through my window. David checked on me, reminding me that I wasn't alone, not really. And as I reflected, something inside me shifted. I thought about the countless people who would hear my story, not for scandal, but for strength. For the reminder that betrayal doesn't define you, and that family is not measured by last names, but by loyalty and love. And if you've ever felt trapped by the weight of toxic ties, I want you to hear this: you are allowed to choose freedom. You are allowed to protect your peace, and you are not alone. As I share this with you now, I can feel the next chapter of my life unfolding, not in courtrooms, but in healing, in reclaiming joy, in finding people who see me, value me, and stand beside me. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Don't let it end here. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow me into the next video, where we'll explore what it truly means to rebuild after breaking free. Because this isn't the end, it's only the beginning. When the courtroom lights faded and the cameras turned away, life didn't suddenly become simple. Healing, I discovered, is not a dramatic moment. It's a quiet daily choice. Every morning, I woke up with the weight of the past still lingering, but little by little, it grew lighter. I started walking more through parks, along city sidewalks, anywhere I could feel the rhythm of my own steps. It reminded me that I was moving forward, even when the path felt uncertain. I picked up books again, cooked meals just for myself, and learned to sit with silence without feeling empty. And here's the truth I want to leave with you: betrayal can break you, but it can also refine you. My parents and sister may have chosen greed, manipulation, and lies, but I chose freedom, peace, and self-respect. That choice was mine to make, and it's one I will never regret. Family, I've learned, isn't always bound by blood. Sometimes it's the friend who checks in when no one else does, the mentor who believes in you, or even the strangers who stand outside a courthouse with signs of support. Love, when real, is never forced. It is freely given. If you are carrying pain like mine, I want you to know you have permission to let go. You can build a new life, brick by brick, filled with people who lift you higher instead of weighing you down. This story may have ended in a courtroom, but the real victory began when I chose myself. And maybe, just maybe, that's the message you needed to hear today.